Arcane Euphoria, the latest and greatest arcane that was added to the game, and by latest and greatest I mean latest, and it is only for blue tomb, so by definition it is the greatest for them, unless there is also an inheritable blue tomb that they would much rather use. Color me shocked if there is. Either way, we got one, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people want to fodder it off to any sort of blue tomb unit that they like, so I figured, as per usual, we would make a guide and talk about some of the potential builds and units that you would probably want to give it to. So we might as well get right into it. Arcane Euphoria is a slaying tome, big shock with every arcane. As slaying, as Spectrum 5, a guaranteed follow-up attack, but instead of having a quicken pulse effect and a null attack penalty effect that the Arcane Eclipse had, this one has true damage based off the unit's attack, which works with AoEs as well, and it provides first hit damage reduction for 30%, which is not bad by any means. I think especially in your more player phase heavy blue tomes that could use stuff such as remote, brash assault, and any of those, it's going to add up relatively quick, and you can find that a lot of these units end up becoming relatively bulky in the player phase. Obviously, there are going to be means to get around it, especially if they have like 20 something defense, but having over 50% damage reduction for the first hit is nothing to scoff at by any means, especially if you've seen something like Summer Shamir around. She doesn't exactly have the best mix bulk, but she gets a lot of damage reduction, so it's pretty difficult to take her out in one hit, and overall the tome is relatively solid. I think it does fall into that niche of it's so general that there isn't any definitive user of it, but at the same time, that's also a good thing because a lot of units can really just take advantage of the weapon and not have to worry about it. For example, we have the infantry, and as per usual with infantry, they can use pretty much everything. Infantry do have access to Flier as well, which is actually a really nice combination with the arcane, as you can not only shrug off whatever damage that you are taking, but you could heal back in the process and continually maintain the condition and maintain your player phase presence with relative ease. The idea is that you would want to run another damage reduction skill, maybe something along the lines of Remote Sparrow or Remote Mirror, depending on which infantry you're using and whether or not they have a speed stat. That with the arcane gives you roughly 51% damage reduction if I remember correctly, and then that combined with Flare, Magic No Follow-Up, and Oath, and Blade Session, basically anything that caters to just stacking up a bunch of attack and speed. Even with the guaranteed follow-up, it's always nice just to have that safety net, or again, if it's on a slower unit, you're basically just stacking up attack, defense, res, whichever possible, and on the second attack you should be able to get Flare off, and depending on how much HP you lost in the process, assuming there was a counter, then you should be able to heal back a good amount of HP in the process. I don't think they're going to be struggling with damage even if they don't get the full 60% from Flare. I think the amount they would be getting plus the healing would be doing a good amount for them anyway. And with Magic No Follow-Up, they're going to be hitting consistently hard, especially against units that would otherwise prove to be a struggle with damage reduction properties. You also have AoE builds, which is also par for the course because it adds the true damage even before combat. So if you were to stack up somebody with a lot of speed and a lot of res, they could also bypass stuff like Dragon Wall and potentially Close Call in any of those. Although the latter might be more difficult because they also have the Phantom effect, making it much more difficult to meet those speed checks. Even so, for those that have a lot more res, they can easily shred through stuff that has damage reduction based off that stat. You stack up a bunch of attack as possible and have a system where you can continually loop the special. Special Spiral times pulse makes sense. You want the external charges. The only thing that you would have to really worry about is getting some extra pulses from some outside support, but given the state of Fae right now, it's not really all too difficult. In worst case scenario, you could always run some sort of infantry pulse support and quick and pulse Sacred Seal, and you should be good there. Otherwise, you could continually just loop specials with Spiral 4 and Finish and any of those and just hit really hard if needed. The arcane does help with setting up because of the damage reduction that it does have, but 30% can be finicky at times. If you do want to be a bit more secure, you could always go with remote, but in my opinion, you probably don't need it, and if you are really that concerned with damage output, remote's probably not your best option anyway, especially over Finish that grants additional damage. And again, as reference for your slower ones, you could use something like Brash Assault, so even in a scenario where there's follow-up denial, you could still double through it because guaranteed follow-ups do stack. Although follow-up denial isn't exactly common anyway, it's still something that you can take advantage of, especially since it does have added damage reduction. And then you could also free up your A slot for something like Unity if you're using something like Legendary Robin support, but now that we have Defense Res Ploy, it's definitely going to be a lot more finicky, especially in Aether Raids. It's something that you could also swap onto their C slot if they have the res stat. And speaking of guaranteed follow-up stacking, you could always run something like Wind Sweep or Water Sweep on a unit that is naturally fast, because the guaranteed follow-up will cancel out the follow-up prevention, and as long as they're able to meet the speed check, then they're going to be able to double through it and get the fire sweep effect. Just keep in mind that if you're going up against a hardy fighter unit, it's not really going to do anything because they cancel out that, and you're just going to only be hitting once. And lastly, you can make a blue Desert Nino because they more or less kind of have the same gimmicks for the most part. They have first hit damage reduction, even though Nino's does have a bit more. She does have to get her special off first. This one you don't necessarily have to, but the ideal thing is that you don't get hit first, is that you hit first back. And with something like Times Pulse 4 and Attack Speed Finish 4, you should be able to do an instant special right out of the gate. It's pretty much just her build lifted onto a blue tome, and I don't think it's bad by any means. Outside of your infantry, of course, you have your cavalry builds, which are definitely going to be a bit more limited. Same with the flyers, but at the same time, they only have so many skills that they really want anyway, given their archetype. They're mainly going to be prioritizing their player phase present, so you definitely want to stack the sets that cater to them the most. Although, as far as I know, most of them is attack and speed anyway. You can still do the guaranteed follow-up shtick that you did with the infantry, where you just stack up a bunch of attack and speed. And if you're still able to make the speed check by canceling out the guaranteed follow-up from the weapon, then you're still going to be able to double with a fire sweep effect. Speed res menace could always be better, although I like the idea of attack res menace because not only does it have a decent amount of stat swings for damage, but also if you have to take a hit from something that targets your res, then you're probably going to eat a hit much more easily that way. And in a similar vein, you could always just, again, stack Remote Sparrow or any of those skills that provide damage reduction and run a hit and run set. Assuming you are getting countered, it's going to be very, very easy to fall into the escape route range, but if you are going up against foes that don't counter, then you could always run the Fury Seal just in case. Just keep in mind that it will push you out of the arcane range much faster. And otherwise, you can take advantage of Flared Sparrow, which is a relatively new skill that sets up fire terrain, which could be really great for shutting off any sort of mages or ranged nukes coming in if they don't have any sort of terrain nullification gimmick. I would say it's really nice, especially on hit and run units, but you would want to have some sort of protection, or you would want to outsource the Canto just because it's going to be much more difficult to get off otherwise. Next, there are the Flier Builds, and these are also relatively limited in scope, but I think the biggest difference here is that you could also use something like a Unity build with Vantage, because more often than not, they're going to be near allies, so it's not as big of a deal. The idea is that you would want to run the same thing as you were running it on the infantry, but because they lock the pulse gimmicks, you would want to attach it to something like Brave Robin, who could provide the pulse during combat, and they could always instantly retaliate with a Moonbow or a Glimmer or anything of the sort. As long as you're able to retaliate with a special and make the speed check, you should be fine. Otherwise, you could still do the same thing as the Cavs were doing. You set up something like Flared Sparrow and hit and run strategies so that you could set up utility and terrain and make your allies and general defensive prowess much stronger, although it will ultimately depend on the mode you go into. This is definitely more catered to something like Summoner Duels than anything else, but depending on the Aetherits map, it could also be convenient, although any sort of warping will get around it anyway. And if you do have somebody that's on the bit of the slower end, you could always just continually stack up their mixed bulk as much as possible and just make them a really bulky monster that also is able to deal damage. And lastly, there are the armors, and these are primarily enemy phase units, as with most armors not named Edelgard. We don't have a lot of them, and I'm pretty sure all of them are locked behind some sort of seasonal banner, so if you do have any of these, chances are they're probably going to be speed oriented, so you probably want to cater to that as much as possible. Suck up their attack and speed as much as possible. They have a slaying effect. They could use Armored Flow relatively well just for the added benefit of damage reduction, and Savvy 4 does provide additional first hit damage reduction, and assuming there isn't any brave attacks, they should be able to shrug off a fair amount of damage. But if you are worried about their sustainability, you could always go with a special fighter set so that they could always instantly retaliate with a special and heal back a good amount of health that they would have otherwise lost just from taking a hit. And those are pretty much it when it comes to the builds. It is a general weapon for the most part, but I also think there aren't a lot of units that want it as much as a lot of the other arcanes. And that isn't to say there aren't units that don't want it, because there's plenty of units that would absolutely benefit from using it, such as any of the generic infantry, a lot of the outdated PRFs on older units, some units that don't or aren't getting a refine, or if they are getting a refine, it's not going to be for a long time. There's a big old list on the screen that I would recommend you'd probably want to give it to. Otherwise, I'm not really sure about the rest. Some of them I was also just kind of in between, like Olwen and Reinhardt. Theoretically, they would probably be better in terms of damage output if you gave it to them, but at the same time, they kind of lose any sort of individuality if you do that. Ophelia is kind of the same, but setting up AoEs isn't difficult anymore, and her niche isn't exactly as great because she doesn't have any true damage on her AoEs. And then there are the dancers, and they don't really need it, but if you really wanted to give it to a dancer, you can. So that's why they're in the either or category as well. Otherwise, a lot of them do want to keep their PRFs, and shocker, a lot of them are modern, but there are a good amount of the older ones that either got refines or weapons that still do their job relatively well. Like Micaiah has her dual effectiveness, and while she doesn't have slaying in her weapon, she still has damage reduction and she has a guaranteed follow-up, so it's not really as needed for her. And to be honest, I think having the additional damage output is probably going to be a lot better with the effectiveness. Asta recently got her refine, and it has a fire sweep effect and a guaranteed follow-up. Alphonse is a fantastic unit. Ishtar still has half no follow-up, which is really good, and so on and so forth. You will notice that a lot of them are modern and, again, don't really need it, so I highly recommend not giving it to a lot of these units on the list. And other than that, there's 2 units that should be due for refines within this book, although it depends on how often you want to wait. Ilyana, I'm pretty sure, is going to be getting a refine in the coming months, so it could easily be at the end of the year or early next year, but who knows with IS, they refined Brave Erica before Chad, so and Guinevere, if I remember correctly, is at the end of the book, and while that is ways away, if you are willing to wait it out, there's a good chance that our weapon is going to end up being better than the Arcane anyway. And other than that, that's really about it for the Arcane video. This one's a lot more straightforward than a lot of the other ones. I think part of it has to do with their skill accessibility. I think the other part of it has to do with the fact that a lot of them already have decent enough weapons that they would much rather use. And if you do end up pulling for this weapon, who do you plan to give it to? Or if you do plan on pulling for Plumeria, are you just going to fodder a C slot? Because chances are that's what I'm going to do. Anyway, if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I will see you later.